A dangerous, multi-day, severe weather event is barreling toward the heart of the country, and tens of millions of people are about to be caught in its path over the next 3 days. This is not a single storm system passing through and moving on. This is a rolling, multi-day sequence of damaging wind events, large hail, and a legitimate tornado threat that will shift from the northern plains through the upper Midwest, across the Ohio Valley, and into the mid-Atlantic, one region after another. And as if that weren't enough on its own, the Gulf Coast now has to watch a separate, entirely unrelated threat brewing offshore, where a tropical system is showing a real chance of organizing into our next named storm. Two completely different hazards unfolding on two completely different timelines, both demanding your attention at the same time. A tremendous amount of ground to cover today, and a tremendous amount still ahead of us over the next several days as this pattern continues to unfold across the entire country. Before we dive into the day-by-day breakdown, here's the big picture framing you need going in. Of the next 3 days, today actually carries the lowest overall severe weather risk. Monday is where this really escalates, especially across Wisconsin and the surrounding states. Tuesday keeps the intensity going, but shifts the bullseye into the Ohio Valley and toward the mid-Atlantic, an area with a much higher population density, which raises the stakes considerably. And running underneath all of it, quietly, is that tropical system in the Gulf that we'll circle back to once we've walked through the severe weather side of things. And let's start with today. Two separate slight risk zones are in play. The first stretches across the northern plains, and the second runs from around Atlanta, Georgia, back into eastern North Carolina, including the Cape Fear region. On top of those two slight risk areas, there's a marginal risk in place for Minneapolis, western Wisconsin, near Eau Claire, up toward Duluth, and into northern Iowa. A separate marginal zone also covers Florida and back toward the Gulf Coast. So if you're anywhere in these zones today, this is not a day to completely ignore the sky, even though, relatively speaking, this is the calmest of the next 3 days. The headline threat today is damaging wind, and the numbers vary quite a bit depending on where you are. If you live in North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, or Wyoming, this is the area where gusts could reach as high as 80 miles per hour if a supercell manages to organize and produce a strong downburst. That is a significant damaging wind speed, capable of snapping tree limbs, downing power lines, and causing real structural damage to outbuildings, so don't take that number lightly just because it's early in this multi-day sequence. Outside of that specific zone, the more general wind threat today tops out around 65 miles per hour, which is still enough to cause scattered damage, particularly to weaker trees and temporary structures. There's also a large hail component to watch today, mainly if you live near Grand Forks or Fargo in North Dakota. A supercell or two in that corridor could produce hail up to baseball size, which is large enough to dent vehicles, damage roofing, and shatter windows if you're caught out in it. Away from that specific corridor, the overall large hail risk today is on the lower side. As for tornadoes, the Storm Prediction Center has essentially ruled that threat out for today. It's about as close to a zero tornado risk as you'll see in an active pattern like this one, so if you're anywhere in today's risk zones, your primary concerns should be wind and, in that one corridor up near the Canadian border, large hail. Down in the Carolinas today, the story is a little different and, honestly, a little more routine. There will be a round of popcorn-style thunderstorms this afternoon, the kind that fire up on a summer afternoon and produce scattered damaging wind gusts up to around 65 miles per hour, along with isolated pockets of penny-sized to quarter-sized hail. If you live in this region, this is genuinely an ordinary summertime setup. This is something the Carolinas experience on a near-weekly basis throughout July and August, so there's no reason for this particular piece of today's forecast to catch anyone off guard. Just stay weather aware through the afternoon hours, as you normally would this time of year. Up in the northern plains, there's a passing disturbance tracking through Canada that will support at least some supercell development during the late afternoon and early evening hours, mainly in the vicinity of Bismarck and Mobridge. These storms will mostly be producing large hail and damaging wind gusts rather than tornadoes. The tornado threat in this corridor today is about as low as it gets, essentially near zero. If a tornado were to spin up anywhere, the most likely location would be back toward Fargo or Grand Forks. But by the time storms reach that far east, they're expected to lose the kind of organization needed to produce a tornado. Most of what develops out there is likely to become elevated in nature, which further suppresses the tornado risk. So again, wind and hail are your headline concerns in that region today, not tornadoes. Overnight tonight into Monday morning, most of today's storm activity should weaken considerably, but there will still be some scattered showers and thunderstorms lingering across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Here's why that overnight activity actually matters quite a bit for how tomorrow unfolds. There are two distinct scenarios that could play out, depending on how much morning convection we end up with. If there's a lot of leftover morning storm activity, it tends to stabilize the atmosphere to some degree, which usually leads to a more widespread, but more wind-dominant severe weather event later in the day. On the other hand, if there's less morning convection, the atmosphere stays more unstable and primed, which tends to favor more discrete individual supercells forming, and that scenario carries a notably higher tornado threat. So there are genuinely two different paths this could take, and which one we get will become clearer as we move through the morning hours. Before we move into Monday, it's worth taking a moment to talk about why this pattern is coming together the way it is, because understanding the mechanics behind it helps explain why forecasters are so confident that this is going to be a multi-day, multi-region event rather than a single isolated round of storms. A powerful upper-level trough is diving into the Midwest and Great Lakes region, and when a disturbance like that interacts with strong wind shear, meaning winds that change speed and direction with height, it creates an environment that favors rotating supercell thunderstorms rather than ordinary, short-lived pop-up storms. Supercells are more capable of producing all three of the major severe weather hazards at once: damaging wind, large hail, and tornadoes. That's part of why this setup is being treated with this level of urgency across so many states at the same time. And because this same broad pattern is expected to persist, with a sweeping cold front dragging through the Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic by Tuesday and Wednesday, the threat doesn't end after one afternoon. It effectively resets and repeats itself across a new set of states as the days go on. Now, let's talk about Monday, because this is where the forecast takes a serious step up in intensity. A level 3 out of 5 enhanced risk of severe weather is now in place, and it covers most of Wisconsin. If you live in Milwaukee, Madison, Janesville, Green Bay, or even back toward Des Moines, you fall inside that enhanced risk zone, where numerous to widespread severe thunderstorms are expected during the afternoon and evening hours. Beyond that enhanced risk area, there's a slight risk in place for Chicago, Des Moines, and Minneapolis, and a marginal risk extending to Omaha, Sioux Falls, Peoria, and Detroit. Here's why tomorrow is such a serious concern. There's a real possibility that one or more clusters of thunderstorms will remain ongoing and organized long enough to trigger a more widespread damaging wind event, with gusts potentially reaching as high as 85 miles per hour. If you live anywhere in Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, or Minnesota, this is the moment to take action ahead of time. Bring in or secure trampolines. Tie down or store anything loose in your yard, whether that's patio furniture, garbage cans, or lightweight structures. There's a real chance of flying debris tomorrow afternoon and evening, and the kind of wind gusts being forecast are more than capable of turning ordinary yard items into genuinely dangerous projectiles. Large hail is also a real threat tomorrow, primarily out of the initial round of supercells that develop. If you live in or near Minneapolis, Rochester, Green Bay, or anywhere in between, plan on protecting your vehicle if at all possible, because baseball-sized hail is realistically on the table with these storms. That size of hail can shatter windshields, dent body panels, and cause thousands of dollars in vehicle damage in a matter of minutes. And then there's the tornado component, which is a genuine concern tomorrow, particularly early on. The highest tornado risk will be centered right where those initial supercells first develop, which is expected to be near Rochester in northern Iowa, before the activity gradually shifts toward the south and east through the afternoon. If you live near Cedar Rapids, or just west of Green Bay near Wausau, tomorrow is a day to be on genuinely high alert for the possibility of a tornado. There's also an isolated tornado risk that extends to Minneapolis, Chicago, and over toward Grand Rapids, Michigan. So even outside the highest risk corridor, this is not a day to assume you're in the clear. Let's walk through how Monday should actually unfold hour by hour, because the timing here matters quite a bit if you're trying to plan your day around this. Storms are expected to fire up somewhere between 1 and 3 in the afternoon, just to the south and east of Minneapolis, pushing into central and southern Wisconsin. These initial storms will mainly be producing damaging wind gusts, but this is also the window where the tornado environment is at its most favorable, centered specifically in central and southern Wisconsin. If discrete supercells manage to organize during this early to mid-afternoon window, that's when the tornado risk is at its peak. Even as the afternoon transitions into evening, any storms that remain active will still carry the potential to produce a tornado or two. By around 4 o'clock, storms should become considerably more widespread, especially in the area near Madison and just north of Milwaukee. This is the window where those 85-mile-per-hour wind gusts become a real possibility. Well, by 5 o'clock, the coverage expands even further with storms active across Milwaukee, the area just north of Milwaukee, Madison, La Crosse, and even out toward Rochester. At this point, there should be several separate clusters of thunderstorms all ongoing at once, and all of them capable of producing significant wind damage, along with a continued chance of a tornado or two embedded within them. By 6 o'clock, that activity begins rolling southeast toward Chicago, and it continues pushing as far as Kalamazoo, Michigan. One of the more unusual and genuinely important aspects of tomorrow's setup is the possibility that some communities could end up getting hit not once, but 2 or 3 separate times as these different clusters of storms roll through in sequence. If you live in Madison, or Janesville specifically, do not assume that once one round of storms passes, the danger is ended for the day. There's a real chance that additional rounds move through later in the afternoon and evening, so continue monitoring conditions, even after what feels like the first wave has cleared. Stepping back and summarizing Monday as a whole, the primary concern is damaging wind, with gusts in the 60 to 85 plus mile per hour range being the headline threat across the affected states. There is a possibility of a couple of strong tornadoes, and it's not out of the question that several tornadoes touch down across Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota over the course of the day. That said, the odds of that more extreme scenario playing out are relatively low. It would essentially require the atmosphere to come together almost perfectly for tomorrow to become a major high-end tornado day. The more probable outcome is that this ends up being primarily a significant and widespread wind event, which on its own is more than capable of producing real, costly damage across a broad area. As the evening progresses, storms are expected to continue pushing through central and northern Illinois and into northern Indiana. A separate round of thunderstorms is also likely to develop during the late evening hours over Iowa, and that round is expected to bring another push of significant damaging wind gusts. Then, as we move into the overnight hours and into early Tuesday morning, there should still be an active line of thunderstorms working its way across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois. Whatever remains of that Monday night line of storms is going to play a meaningful role in setting up exactly how Tuesday's severe weather event unfolds across the Ohio Valley and into the Northeast. Now let's shift to Tuesday, because unfortunately, this next round of severe weather is aimed squarely at one of the most densely populated corridors in the entire country, Columbus and Pittsburgh. A slight risk extends to Cleveland, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, while a marginal threat stretches out to Nashville, Charlotte, and western New England. Every single hazard that severe thunderstorms can produce is back on the table for Tuesday, including the risk of significant and widespread damaging winds, the chance of large hail, and the possibility of a few tornadoes, potentially including at least one strong tornado. Here's how Tuesday's setup is expected to come together. Starting around 1 to 2 o'clock Central Time, storms should begin developing across several different zones more or less simultaneously. One area of development is expected near Syracuse in central Pennsylvania. A second area should set up from around Pittsburgh back into Columbus. And a third zone of storm development is expected across Indiana and Illinois. Around the lunch hour, there may still be a few leftover storms from the overnight activity, but the larger concern is these fresh clusters that begin firing up in the early afternoon. Any of these initial storms could briefly produce a tornado, especially if a discrete supercell manages to organize before storms start clustering together. However, the overall expectation is that these storms grow upscale fairly quickly into larger clusters and lines, which shifts the dominant threat toward damaging straight-line wind across both the Ohio Valley and the Northeast. One specific detail worth calling out is that the significant tornado parameter, a metric used to assess the environment's overall favorability for stronger tornadoes, is currently forecast to peak in the area around Cincinnati, Louisville, and Columbus. That's the corridor where forecasters have the highest confidence in an elevated tornado risk developing during the early to mid-afternoon hours specifically. Outside of that corridor, the values supporting that same parameter are considerably lower, though not entirely zero. When those values sit in that lower range, it typically signals two things. First, that the overall tornado risk is on the lower side, and second, that any tornadoes that do occur in that environment tend to be weaker rather than stronger. So while a strong tornado can't be completely ruled out anywhere within Tuesday's risk area, the Cincinnati, Louisville, and Columbus corridor is genuinely the area to watch most closely for that possibility. By around 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the storm coverage across this corridor should become considerably more widespread, echoing a similar pattern to what unfolded recently across this same general region, when several clusters of storms produced primarily damaging wind, along with a handful of tornado warnings mixed in along the way. The expectation for Tuesday is a similar overall outcome, with damaging wind again serving as the dominant threat, though the tornado risk may run just slightly higher this time around, particularly within that Ohio Valley corridor we just discussed. By 5 to 6 o'clock, the line of storms should be moving across Kentucky, with fairly widespread coverage by that point. Then by roughly 7 o'clock Central Time, which is 8 o'clock Eastern, storms should be approaching Allentown and pushing on toward New York City and Albany. There's a real possibility that 2 separate lines of thunderstorms could be active simultaneously by this point in the evening, which would mean widespread damaging wind impacts stacking up across a broad stretch of the Northeast. If current trends continue to build through the afternoon, there There's even a chance this activity organizes into a longer-lived, fast-moving wind event capable of producing extensive, widespread damage along its path. As we move into the overnight hours, heading into Wednesday morning, nearly all of this severe weather activity should finally begin winding down. At that point, attention shifts to what's expected on Wednesday, which will primarily be a risk of scattered severe storms running from around the Washington, D.C. area back into Columbia, South Carolina. High-resolution computer model guidance isn't fully available yet for this particular stage of the forecast, but the current expectation is that storm activity on Wednesday will stay mostly confined closer to the coastline in areas like Raleigh, Charlotte, and Virginia Beach. There isn't a strong signal right now for much severe weather reaching as far north as Maryland or New York City on Wednesday. So if you live in that broader Wednesday risk zone, I expect any severe weather to remain isolated to scattered in coverage, with the greatest chances concentrated across the Carolinas and far eastern Virginia. Before we shift over to the tropical side of this forecast, let's talk briefly about how you should actually prepare for these next couple of days if you live anywhere inside Monday's or Tuesday risk zones, because the mechanics of a threat only matter if you know what to do with that information. If you're in one of the enhanced risk areas, whether that's Wisconsin on Monday or the Cincinnati, Columbus, and Pittsburgh corridor on Tuesday, make sure you have a reliable way to receive warnings even if you're asleep or away from a television, since a lot of these storms are expected to develop and intensify during the afternoon, in evening hours when people are often out and about or winding down for the night. Identify the sturdiest part of your home now, ideally a small interior room or basement, rather than trying to figure that out in the middle of a warning. If you're planning to be outdoors, at a ball game, a cookout, or any kind of outdoor event, keep an eye on the sky and have a plan for shelter in mind before storms ever get close, since a wind gust in the 80 mile per hour range can turn lawn furniture, umbrellas, and tents into serious hazards in a matter of seconds. And if you're driving anywhere in these risk zones during the afternoon or evening hours on Monday or Tuesday, keep in mind that large hail and strong wind gusts can develop rapidly along a line of storms, so don't hesitate to pull off safely and wait it out if visibility drops or hail becomes a factor. We also want to make sure you're staying with us through the rest of this forecast, because a pattern this active tends to shift in the details even when the overall theme stays the same. So make sure you're subscribed and that notifications are turned on for this channel, because we'll be tracking every update to this severe weather threat and to the tropical system in the Gulf as new model data comes in. Now, severe thunderstorms aren't the only major story developing right now, and this next part deserves your full attention if you live anywhere near the Gulf Coast. There is currently a 50% chance of a tropical cyclone developing in the Gulf over the next several days, broken down further into a 40% chance of development within the next 48 hours, and that same 50% chance when you extend the window out over the full forecast period. Right now, there's a small area of spin centered just off the Florida coast, just to the west of Tampa, and the expectation is that this feature will meander generally to the north and west over the next couple of days. The single biggest question mark with this system is exactly how far west it ends up tracking, because the farther west this area of spin travels, the significantly better chance it has of organizing into an actual tropical storm, or even potentially a low-end hurricane down the line. Right now, the more likely scenario appears to be that something does try to organize over the next day or two, most probably resulting in a tropical depression or a low-end tropical storm, which would bring the potential for heavy rainfall to portions of the Gulf Coast. Exactly how far south and west this system ultimately sits remains genuinely uncertain at this stage, and that track is going to be the deciding factor in how significant this system ultimately becomes. Looking at the model guidance specifically, this area of spin is expected to continue circulating roughly 24 to 48 hours from now, just to the west of Tampa, Florida, holding around 1,010 millibars through tonight. Then, moving into tomorrow morning, the guidance shows this feature gradually intensifying on Monday into a low-end tropical storm positioned just south of Pensacola. If that development does occur, this system would be named Bertha. Other model guidance shows a broadly similar outcome, with the system remaining around low-end tropical storm strength before eventually moving inland somewhere around Alabama, Mississippi, or Louisiana by Wednesday. A few individual model runs have even shown this system tracking as far west as Houston, though the majority of guidance has since backed away from that particular solution and shifted back toward a Louisiana or Florida landfall instead. Breaking this down into the three realistic scenarios currently on the table, the first scenario has this system moving into the Florida panhandle without ever fully organizing into a tropical cyclone at all, and that scenario currently carries something like a 20 to 30% chance of occurring. The second, and currently the most likely scenario at around a 50% chance, has the system tracking toward the New Orleans or Pensacola area, most likely as a low-end tropical storm by the time it arrives. The third scenario, carrying a lower probability of around 10%, has the system tracking all the way west toward Houston. And if that particular path does verify, this system would have a meaningfully better chance of strengthening into either a stronger tropical storm or potentially even a hurricane. Regardless of which of these three scenarios ultimately plays out, the primary concern tied to this system is flash flooding along the coast, with the potential for a few inches of rainfall in areas like Tallahassee, Pensacola, or New Orleans. Wind speeds tied to the system could reach somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 miles per hour wherever landfall ultimately occurs. For the majority of people living along this stretch of the Gulf Coast, this is a type of system you've very likely weathered at least once before, and this is not a scenario that warrants outright panic. That said, staying aware over the next several days is genuinely important, particularly in case there are any significant shifts in the forecast track or intensity, which we will make sure to pass along the moment they happen. If you live along the coast, anywhere between the Florida Panhandle and Louisiana, it's not a bad idea to use the next couple of days to double-check that you have flashlights, batteries, and a few days of drinking water on hand, simply as routine precaution, given how uncertain the exact track and intensity still are at this stage. None of that is meant to alarm you. It's simply the kind of basic readiness that makes sense anytime a system like this is sitting in the Gulf with a real chance of organizing further before it reaches land. So, to bring all of this together, over the next 3 days you are looking at a serious, evolving multi-day severe weather threat that moves from the northern plains and upper Midwest on Monday into the Ohio Valley, mid-Atlantic and Northeast on Tuesday, before finally shifting toward the Carolinas and far eastern Virginia by Wednesday. Damaging wind is the consistent, dominant threat running through all 3 days. Large hail remains a real concern in several specific corridors. And there's a legitimate, if lower probability, tornado risk woven throughout, particularly across Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota on Monday, and again near Cincinnati, Louisville, and Columbus on Tuesday. Layered on top of all of that severe weather is a separate developing tropical system in the Gulf that could bring heavy rain and gusty winds to the Gulf Coast later this week, regardless of whether it ever officially becomes a named storm. This is genuinely one of the more active, multi-hazard weather patterns we've covered in a while, and it's the kind of setup that deserves your continued attention as it evolves, rather than a single passing glance today. From the enhanced risk over Wisconsin tomorrow, to the highly populated Ohio Valley and Mid-Atlantic corridor on Tuesday, to whatever ultimately develops out of that spin in the Gulf, there are a lot of moving pieces to this forecast, and each one of them has the potential to affect a different group of people over the next few days. Thank you all so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the updates on this fast-moving pattern over the next several days, since forecasts like this one tend to shift in the details as new data comes in. We'll have another full breakdown tomorrow morning with the very latest on how Monday's severe weather threat is trending, whether that tornado risk across Wisconsin and Iowa is shifting up or down, and any new information on the tropical system developing in the Gulf. Stay safe out there, stay weather aware, keep an eye on the sky over the next several days, and we'll see you in the next video.